All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's uh, webinar for you all in the DOE Energy Innovator Fellows program. Today's topic, really exciting one for me at least, demand flexibility. I've been doing demand flexibility, demand response related work for quite a while, and got a great set of speakers for you today. My name's Pete Cappers. Some of you may have seen me present a couple of months ago in one of the webinars. I am actually going to be your MC today, but I'm actually going to be your MC going forward. Lisa Schwartz has decided to retire. It's pretty incredible. She's been a real institution in the industry, been a huge proponent of the Energy Innovator Fellows program. She's been running this informational webinar series for several years now, and really sad to see her go. Hopefully I can do a adequate job of filling those really big shoes. So for today's program, what she had set up was presentations from three experts in this field, two of which are from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. First, we're going to have Sean Murphy. We're going to end with Eliot Crowe. And then in the middle, we've got Cisco DeVries, a professor out of the University of California, Berkeley, their Goldman School of Public Policy. I'm not going to waste time going through their bios. You certainly have access to the slide deck that's up on the website. You can see all of their background information and what they're going to bring to the table to talk to you today. Before I turn things over to them, I do want to remind you all that we do not have a meeting in July. It's summertime. Who wants to attend a webinar? People are going to be out on vacation, hopefully. So our next meeting is scheduled for August 18th at 2 o'clock Eastern. There you're going to be able to hear from one of our other colleagues here at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Natalie Frick. She's going to be talking about some recent research she completed on stakeholder engagement requirements and practices in distribution system planning. This is a really interesting presentation. It was based on, it's coming from research that was funded by the Energy Technology Innovation Program that DOE runs. That is basically a community facing a community supporting technical assistance program and research program. In particular, what Natalie did in the research was recognize the fact that a lot of these communities who are interested in reliability, resilience, and really charting their own course from an energy standpoint ultimately have to coordinate with a utility. And that's oftentimes within the context of distribution system planning proceedings. And so this presentation, the research that it's based on, really comes out of that concept of how do you get communities more involved in distribution system planning proceedings. So this is actually, I think, of really important interest to a bunch of you in attendance here, those of you who are fellows at cooperative utilities, municipal utilities, maybe even tribes. These are all going to be institutions that are going to potentially be involved or need to be involved in these kind of distribution system planning proceedings. And so this is going to give you some insights into how you might do that on the and maybe even on the energy office side in terms of energy offices and get engaging and supporting communities. Then on the PUC side, I could see some real benefits of folks attending and listening in as a way to understand how might you begin to see communities showing up in these proceedings, or how might you alter some of the ways in which the proceedings are held to make better room for these communities. So really great presentation. It's again on August 18th from 2 to 3. I will make sure to put in a link for a registration link into the chat so you all can register while you're listening to our three presenters today. So like I said, Sean's going to kick us off. He's going to turn things over to Cisco, and then we end with Eliot. As you're hearing those presentations given, please do submit your questions and comments into the chat box. I'll be collecting them, kind of organizing them, and then facilitating Q&A after each one of the presentations. And then at the end, we'll just kind of open it up. Maybe there'll be some insights or comments or questions you all might have that relate to multiple presentations you saw today, and that'll be the great time. That'll be a great time to bring those up. And so without any further ado, let me hand things over to you, Sean.
All right. Thank you, Pete, and hello, everyone. My name's Sean Murphy. I'm an energy policy researcher in the energy markets and planning department at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And today I'm going to be providing an overview of demand flexibility programs and rates offered by utilities in the US. So first, I'm going to start off with, or first, I want to talk about some of the objectives of the presentation. Hopefully, this will set up everything that Cisco and Eliot talk about later. I want to offer a definition of demand flexibility. You do sometimes hear competing definitions, but there's one I wanted to include here that I've found pretty helpful in the past. I also want to talk about why demand flexibility is important for the electricity system. Then talk about some common types of utility programs and electricity rates that promote demand flexibility and describe some of the characteristics and impacts of these programs and rates. So, what is demand flexibility? It is the capability of customer-sided technologies to shed, shift, modulate, and generate electricity. So, what do I mean by shed? Well, this figure on the right sort of illustrates these four modes of demand flexibility that is mentioned. So, with a shed, you can think of just a reduction in load at some point of time in response to a grid signal. That might be from the grid operator, such as an independent service operator, or the utility. So the gap that you see between that black line and this bluish line is the impact of a shed. It's sort of reducing load. Well, this is probably about, evening time in response to some signal. With shifting load, it's moving load from a peak period to an off-peak period. The result is you have a large reduction in load during that peak period. Again, there's that gap between the black and the blue lines, and then sort of a slight increase in usage in that on-peak period. So you can think of that as maybe pre-cooling a building so that you don't have to use as much of your air conditioning during a hot summer evening. Modulating load operates on a sort of finer time scale. This can happen on the order of, seconds even. So it's often with inverter-based resources that are automatically adjusting power draw or injections to help maintain grid frequency or control system voltage. Shed and shift are usually responding to the sort of need for capacity. So often, generation, but this is a demand side equivalent. So making sure that we're balancing supply and demand. And then modulate is sort of operating at sort of finer time scale. And then generating load, as we have in the bottom, is, as what it sounds like, it's injecting energy into the electricity system. So that could be sort of rooftop PV or a diesel generator. Demand flexibility is important for the grid because it can lower electricity system costs. Power is very expensive during peak periods. So think, hot July afternoon and evening, that's when all the generators are running. And that's the most expensive time to operate the electricity system because we're bringing on units that really only exist for those few hours of the year. Demand flexibility can reduce that demand and then avoid the need for that expensive generation. Demand flexibility can also help avoid upgrades to the distribution system infrastructure. So we build our electricity system, including the distribution system, for those peak periods. So a utility may want to, build a new substation in order to meet demand 5, 10 years out. But if you're able to decrease peak demand, you may be able to put that investment in a new substation off by another few years and sort of save electricity customers money by pushing off those investments. In order for utilities to design programs that promote demand flexibility, it's helpful for them to see what other utilities are doing and understand sort of the breadth of program designs and sort of performance characteristics. Regulators also benefit from this data so that they can set goals and conduct oversight. Often it's hard to get all of the data on these programs and rates in one place, which is why we established a research project a few years ago to collect a lot of data on demand flexibility programs and rates. And we pulled a bunch of information from publicly available information to characterize event structure, incentive types and amounts, enrollment and participation, and program spending and demand savings. We collected data from across the country, looking at the largest utilities in each state. So we didn't cover every utility, but by covering sort of the majority of electricity sales in each state, we had pretty good coverage over what electric utilities in the United States were offering. So now I'm going to talk about some demand flexibility program characteristics, starting with a bit of an overview of the programs in our data set. So on the left, we have a map showing the states that had programs in our data set. And on the right, we have a figure showing sort of the count of programs by different technology type. We found program in most states, and actually electricity rates from 26 states. So found more states with programs than rates. And the significant majority of the utilities in our sample were investor-owned utilities, though we did have some programs from municipal, or we did look for programs in some municipal utilities, state-run entities, and third-party program administrators. The significant majority of the programs that we found were Wi-Fi thermostat and for batteries. So in the figure on the right, that's the green and orange bars. There were a few other program types, including thermal storage, building automation systems, heat pump, focusing on heat pump water heaters, and then one program that was interrupting load and clothes dryers. So there was a sort of broad range of technologies, but a concentration on two, Wi-Fi thermostats and battery storage. So I just introduced that there are all these different types of programs, and I wanted to sort of connect what these technology types or how each of these technology types sort of provides demand flexibility. In general, utilities are sending signals to these technologies, and they're able to change their operations in response to that signal. So for Wi-Fi thermostats, that means changing the set point such that you're decreasing heating or cooling demand. Similarly, for air conditioners, there are these receivers that can receive signals and then sort of cycle operations, turning them on or off, or just sort of cut back air conditioner usage by some defined percentage amount. Batteries are discharging stored electricity based on utility signals, and then building automation systems in commercial buildings are changing the operation of a range of technologies, whatever's connected to the system. So that could be HVAC, could be lighting, could be different processes that occur in a commercial building. Water heaters are shifting load generally outside of peak periods, often heating the water in the afternoon so that it can then be used in the evening. And then thermal storage, similar to a battery, is releasing the stored thermal energy during some peak period. So there are different strategies that each of these technologies has to sort of reduce demand during particular periods. So as I mentioned earlier, demand flexibility is often focused on peak periods. Very often those peak periods are hot summer afternoons when everyone's turning their air conditioning on. And what we found is that these demand flexibility, these programs tend to operate largely in the summer. So this figure here is showing the count of programs by each of the month, and showing for each month, and it's just showing the months in which these programs say they may operate. So we found for most Wi-Fi thermostat and battery programs, they're only operating in the summer, though there are some programs that are operating in both the summer and winter. And interestingly, most of those were in southern states where you have high levels of electric space heating and you may have winter peaks. So it might be more like 6 a.m. in the morning when everyone's trying to stay warm on a cold winter day, as opposed to a hot July summer afternoon when you have your annual system peak. But in general, these programs are focused on the summer. So next we take a look at sort of the hours in which these programs state that they're going to operate. On the left, we have summer programs, right? We have the winter programs. And what we find is, in the summer days, they're typically focused on the late afternoons and early evenings when there's significant cooling demand, which wasn't too much of a surprise. And then in the winter, we find some slight differences by technology type. The thermostats are more often operating in the winter mornings, which makes sense if that's responding to electric heating needs. But batteries are operating across the day. They can still provide useful discharge of electricity in the morning or in the evening. So there's sort of the multiple uses of the batteries in the winter. Often programs will include rules on the maximum number of events that they allow, so that people are not constantly having to have their sort of systems interrupted or affected by a signal from the utility. They'll also set rules on the maximum length of an event. And so on the left, we show the distribution of the maximum number of events allowed by each program type, each color reflecting a different technology type. And the right is the maximum event length. And we find is, for battery programs, which you see in orange in both figures, generally allow more events than the thermostat programs. And the reason that is because Thermostat programs are affecting your air conditioning system, and that has an effect on just the occupant's thermal comfort. So on a hot summer afternoon, it might mean that your home is a little bit warmer than you otherwise would set your thermostat during one of these events. But a battery doesn't affect that. It's just discharging electricity. So there's an opportunity to have more frequent battery events because it doesn't have this effect on occupant comfort. The event lengths, however, are pretty similar. Between 3 and 4 hours is most common, and pretty close for both the batteries and thermostat programs. So next, I want to talk about some of the incentives that are offered by these programs. Upfront incentives are used to drive technology adoption and program enrollment. An example there could be receiving $75 to join a Wi-Fi thermostat program. A retention incentive is encouraging your continued enrollment. So that could be receiving $25 at the end of the year for staying enrolled in the thermostat program, or with a battery saying you're going to commit 4 kW of battery capacity for 3 or 4 years. It's trying to make sure that you stay enrolled after you've already joined. Performance incentives, in contrast, are incentivizing the reduction of energy or demand in a particular period. So an example there would be the dollar per average kW of battery capacity provided across multiple events. So basically, the more demand flexibility you do, the more you get paid. And we find is that there's some differences in how these different technology type program types are using incentives. So this figure on the right is sort of showing the type of incentive category for each of the technologies. And on the left, we have the Wi-Fi thermostats. Most often, it's a combination of upfront and retention. So that's that sort of bright green lime green bar. So that's you're getting paid to join and getting paid to stay. But there aren't often incentives to sort of increase the impact of a thermostat event. They're not paying. It's uncommon that you're being paid extra to sort of reduce your HVAC usage more. In contrast with battery programs, it's pretty common that there are these performance incentives that are trying to drive larger discharges of the battery usage. And so but overall, the type of battery incentive is a bit more mixed. So sometimes the performance incentives are by themselves. Sometimes they're coupled with performance incentives. But I think in the majority of programs, there is some form of performance incentive used for the battery programs. Um, so far, I have been talking mostly about the thermostats and batteries. That does reflect the sample size of our data set. They were about 85% of the programs. So unfortunately, we don't have as many insights into thermal storage, heat pumps, and building automation systems. But hopefully, potentially in future years, there'll be more programs with more data to report on those. So we did collect or since we had more Wi-Fi thermostats, we were able to look more in more detailed way at the thermostats or at the incentive amounts. So here we take a look at the sort of distribution of the incentive amounts. So the left is the upfront incentive, the right is the retention. In general, the upfront incentives are under $100, and the retention incentives are slightly smaller, or a little bit smaller. Median value here, I think, is about $25. Um, and while these are, each somewhat moderate, they together can kind of offset a significant share of the cost of a Wi-Fi thermostat. They may cost $100, $200. So even in your first year of participation, the incentives are sort of enough to offset maybe even the majority of the cost. We took a look at battery programs as well in a little bit more detail. In most cases, they were customer-owned batteries, although there were a few instances of utilities leasing batteries to customers. That wasn't a common design, but it did appear. We also found that the programs tended to allow standalone systems. So that means they didn't require that you had a rooftop solar paired with the battery. And also that the programs allowed grid charging. You didn't just have to charge it from a battery. We also found that these programs may be trying to balance grid needs with participant needs for backup power. So about a third of the programs had rules on the level of battery capacity that a utility could control during an event. So this may be that utility is saying, we're going to control at a minimum like 40% of the battery. They need to make sure that to have the battery in the program, there's some guarantee that they can actually get something out of it. So there's some minimum, there may be minimum rules on like the amount of capacity that they control. There may also be sort of a maximum level of capacity that a utility can control, which gives some sort of a guarantee to customers that they're going to have power available if there's an outage. So, for example, the utility may commit to only using at most, 80% of the battery's capacity, which would then leave 20% of that capacity for backup power needs for a customer. We also found that some programs prohibited the battery from being discharged for an event if they knew there was a big storm coming. So this was more focused on winter storms in particular. So if there's blizzard coming to New England and there's a concern that there might be an outage, these programs would not discharge. And that would mean that people would retain that power for backup purposes. So now we're going to move into the demand flexibility rates. So the left showing map, this map is showing the states in which we identified rates. So the color variation here reflects the number of rates. So we found, rates in 26 states, but we found, I think, up to more than 20 rates in California. On the right, we have a figure just showing the count of rates by these two categories that we bin them into. So on the left was dynamic rates, which we generally defined as rates that we're changing the price of electricity in response to grid conditions. And the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more detail there. And then we have technology rates, which were time of use rates that had technology requirements. So that could be a time of use rate that was only for batteries or only for customers that had electric space heating or electric heat pumps, something like that. So dynamic rates, as I just said, are rates that change the price of electricity in response to grid conditions. There's a few different flavors here that we looked at, including variable peak pricing, critical peak pricing, and real-time pricing that I'll walk through. But first, I just want to provide a little bit more detail on what I meant by time of use rate, because it's a useful comparison point. So on the bottom here, we have a time of use rate. And that's like they're the peak hours and the price of electricity are static and predetermined. So the price of today on a Monday afternoon is going to be the same this week as it is next week. And as you can see on this figure here, there's increases between the non-peak period and the peak period. When we go up to the variable peak price, the VPP, the peak hours are defined in advance, but the peak price is variable and can change one day ahead. So if I were on a variable peak price rate, the price tomorrow between 6 and 8 p.m. could be different than it is today, reflecting different grid conditions. With a critical peak price, or CPP, which we have as the second one from the top in the light blue, the event hours are set one day in advance, but the event price is static and predetermined in advance. So if I were on a CPP rate and tomorrow there was going to be some event because demand was really increasing, I might know that the price is going to increase by a factor of 3. And then I'd receive a notification that between the hours of 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., the price of electricity would increase. And then on top, we have the real-time price rate, in which the hourly price is variable and typically set one day ahead based on the wholesale price forecast. So that's just, depending on what's happening in the grid, the price of electricity is going to change on an hourly basis in accordance with the variation in the market clearing prices. So it's these three categories of real-time price, critical peak price, and variable peak price that we categorize as dynamic rates in kind of contrast to the time of use rate. So here we have a figure similar to what we looked at with the programs. On the left, we have the distribution of the months in which the programs are operating. And on the right, we have a distribution of the hours in which the rates are operating. And this is very similar to what we found with the programs, and that the dynamic rates are generally targeting summer afternoons and evenings, common across both the CPP, the VPP, and also this sort of variant of critical peak price, which is critical peak rebate. I should have mentioned that in the preceding slide, but let's go back. In kind of similar to the critical peak price, but a critical peak rebate is like if you reduce your demand during a peak period, you'll be paid. So the sort of electricity rate remains the same, but if you reduce demand, there's sort of a payment. So it's an incentive to reduce as opposed to like a penalty for not reducing your demand. And again, similar to the demand flexibility programs, we find that many of these rates set the maximum number of critical peak rates as well as the critical peak price event length. So for the critical peak price rates that we were in our study, the distribution was very similar to what we found for the thermostats. So about a maximum of 15 rates, about 15 events for both the CPP rate and the thermostats and slightly longer event hours for the CPP rates on as a median. I think it was 5 hours in contrast to 4 hours for the Wi-Fi thermostats. But overall, they're very similar designs. Because they're responding to similar conditions of reacting to summer peak periods while trying to sort of balance customer needs for managing their loads. Critical peak price rates will also, as I mentioned, will set this. They'll increase the price of electricity based on some predetermined factor. So that could be a factor of 2, could be a factor of 10, depending on the rate in question. So this figure on the right is showing that ratio of CPP event to non-event rate. That's like the factor by which the price is increasing in the peak period. And there is some pretty broad variation, even within residential programs, which is showing green. So it can go up to a factor of almost 10. And then in commercial programs, commercial rates, we found the factors could be even higher. Actually, in a couple instances, between 150 and 200 times as much, which was higher than we may expected, but I think it was particular to a few rate designs as well. And so the higher the critical peak price rate increases relative to the non-event price, the greater there is an incentive to reduce load during the peak period. So now I just want to talk briefly about some of the program and rate outcomes. Data in general were thinner when it came to the impacts of the programs in terms of how many people were enrolled, the reduction in demand, and how much spending took place. And we tended to have a little bit more data again on the Wi-Fi thermostats. So in this figure, we look at the share of the eligible customer classes that were enrolled in the programs based on the reported utility data. And there's pretty broad variation within these small set of programs. So the enrollment rates range from a 0.1% to almost 6%. So that's 57, 60x factor within these programs themselves. But yeah, this was only 13 different programs, and hopefully more utilities or regulators may require this sort of reporting to give a sense of the sort of potential scale for participation in these programs. But I think the takeaway here is just that the level of participation can vary, and that it's often hard, or rather, there often is not data reported to tell you how many customers are enrolled. We did have some data on the costs and demand reductions, and from that, we calculated a cost of saved peak demand. So that's the dollars per kW reduced on average during these events. And in particular for the Wi-Fi thermostat programs, this cost of saved peak demand was quite low. I think the savings weighted average was $39 per kilowatt, which I think just underscores that demand flexibility is and still can be a very low cost demand resource that's useful for grid planning purposes. Now, just to close with a few key takeaways. Demand flexibility programs and rates are available in most states. We most often were finding Wi-Fi thermostats and battery programs in our data set. Most demand flexibility rates in our study that we found were dynamic rates that were varying prices based on grid conditions. The most common dynamic rate in our analysis was a critical peak pricing rate. Demand flexibility programs and rates are both targeting summer afternoons and early evenings, most often in response to generally summer peaks in many utility jurisdictions. Incentive structures are vary by demand flexibility program type, and data on program and rate outcomes, such as enrollment and demand savings, are generally lacking. And there's definitely an opportunity for regulators to request more from utilities in terms of that reporting and for utilities to provide additional data on their program impacts. All right, and with that, we can move to questions. If anyone has them?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for that great overview. Yeah, any questions folks have for Sean? I don't see any in the chat, so if folks want to take themselves off mute, go right ahead. Okay, well, if you do think of some, please feel free to put them in the chat. Sean will stick around through the end of the presentation, the webinar, and so if you have questions, we can certainly revisit them then. With that, Sean, if you can stop sharing, we can hand things over to Cisco at this point. Great. Thanks, Cisco. It's all yours.
Hey, everybody. Uh, Glad to be here. My name is Cisco DeVries. I've started off government service for the most part, including a stint at the U.S. Department of Energy back in the 1990s. But the last 20 years or so, I spent mostly on the entrepreneurial side, helping to launch, scale, and figure out how to engage folks in homes related to energy, and to do that in a way that was supportive of all kinds of benefits that you just heard about. So I've been on the finance side, I've been on the demand response, dispatch side, and company side, and more recently, I'm now both a lecturer at Goldman School of Public Policy and Hospital of Business, as well as an executive fellow at the Goldman School. And so I've had a chance to sort of step back and think about some of the things that have worked and some of the things that haven't worked. And I just wanted to take a few minutes just from that absolutely spectacular and perfect intro component from Sean to sort of talk a little bit about what I say, the lessons from the front lines. There's a few things that I think of late have become more clear, at least to me, and I think in the data, and I will sort of lay those out for you over the next few minutes. I want to start where I have spent most of my career, which is in the home. And the reason that homes are important, homes are where the grid gets hard, but it's also where the rubber meets the road in terms of reliability and costs, and the political and sort of social component as well. About 20% of US energy is used in homes, but that undersells how important it is, because for the most part, the worst moments on our grid, in the various grids and around the country, happen because of residential demand. So they tend to be, as you just saw, a large number of states and grid operators and utilities have challenges or have peaks that take place in summer evenings, as people get home, as air conditioning and all the other equipment gets turned on, and as solar or other renewables come offline. On the flip side, we are increasingly seeing the winter peak become an enormous problem. So the Southeast, other places where we're now, where the winter peak is both the largest, and that happens in the morning. So this tends to be, again, driven on a residential demand early in the morning when it's very cold, when people get up and start warming up and using energy in their homes. And this is getting more acute as we electrify heating. So those two issues mean that the dealing with residential becomes really critical, not just on an overall amount of energy side, but because of the timing and the specific nature of when electric demand takes place. This is now coinciding with a home energy affordability, some people call crisis, crunch. Certainly an incredible amount of attention and angst has been directed at utility rates, electric bills, for a whole variety of reasons over the last number of years. And so this is an area that's getting a lot of scrutiny from regulators, from politicians, and from just the general public. So that's kind of the challenge and the importance of that. But the good news is there's actually a pretty good head start in how to solve for that. And you heard some of that from Sean, but just to note, there are already in the average home 17 connected devices. You heard a lot about smart thermostats. So homes are already connecting up the things that use energy or that control or can control energy. And so a lot of this has to do with less trying to get people to do something they're not doing on a technology basis or equipment basis, but to start to think about how we make use of the choices they're making already. Jumping in then to a home, I'm vastly oversimplifying it. I spent, as I said, 20 years on the entrepreneurial side, and I spent a lot of time working on smart plugs and behavioral demand response. And I'm a big believer and love all of those things. I have controlled tens of thousands of refrigerators. And I came to love a good controllable refrigerator because it's a little bit of energy, but it's always on. Um, that said, I just want to focus on the four pillars, really, of residential energy today. And the first you just heard about is a smart thermostat. HVAC is 50% of home energy use, which means it's about 10% of all U.S. Energy use is controlled by a thermostat. So if you have a smart thermostat, which is not universal or even the majority, unfortunately, but is obviously quite common. That is a key way to control a huge amount of electricity and energy use in a home. The number two is water heating. So, between heating air and cooling air and heating water, you've got somewhere 2/3 to 3/4 of home energy use on average is actually related to those two things. And that's an enormous head start as we try and look at these, particularly again, as water heating becomes more electrified and the technology and controls for that become more ubiquitous. The water heating, I think, is definitely an exciting new arrival into the space and lots we can hopefully do there in the future. The two big ones that are here-ish and coming are batteries and EV chargers. And interestingly, we didn't see on EV chargers on the earlier slides, and the batteries were a very big portion, just under smart thermostats, of the amount of power of demand response that is available. The interesting thing is, of course, that's a tiny fraction of the number of US homes, and it's still a tiny fraction of the US homes that already have solar. So as batteries come in, both grids, but batteries at home, the whole home batteries, batteries within appliances and devices, all the ways in which we're going to start to see more storage arrive, this is a huge growth area because it does a couple of things that the other ones tend not to do, which is one, it has no comfort basis, no comfort issue. So you can discharge a battery without people being aware that they're hot, as long as you deal with certain extreme conditions. But it is also one in which it is very easy or much easier to control and manage into a virtual power plant capacity that is dispatchable and reliable in a way that looks more like a peaker power plant, although I'd argue that thermostats have pretty much achieved that as well. EV charging is really important because that will continue to grow. Most people have figured out that EV chargers if you have an EV charger and you have a time of use rate, don't charge during evening peaks. So what we saw in running programs was that EV chargers were not by themselves helpful as a demand response tool because people were already shifting their charging. But as the grid gets more dynamic and as these times shift, that's likely to change also as EV charging just becomes more commonplace. So I'm going to dive in here to really just focus on three components. This is the kind of thing that I could spend all day and most of the next day on. But I wanted to hit three things that I think are sort of emerging key components that make a residential grid services demand flexibility program work. Or work at scale. And those three here are the recruit at the decision moment. How do we get from the numbers you saw, the point something percent to the 5%, 10% demand response participation to 60 or 80% participation? And we are now seeing that is possible. Second, how do we understand behavioral economics and the role that it plays in the way that we incentivize customers to take action or to give control over to utilities and grid operators? And then the last is really about how we bake that incentive value in at the front, how we start to think about capacity rather than performance. And I'm going to go through each of these. And of course, all three of them are tightly related. These are not necessarily independent. And I think in the future, as we look back on it, all three will sort of coming together as in a sort of Venn diagram of successful scaled programs. So let's go through each one briefly. The first is the decision moment enrollment. And you saw that generally speaking, and I ran the company called Ohm Connect before its acquisition in a transaction with Google 2 years ago. And what you'd see is that generally speaking, and this is across all of the utility programs, the private third-party programs, is that you can get to about 10% participation as a ceiling. At Ohm Connect, about 10% of the residential customers in Fresno County were members. And that tends to be a ceiling. You can get a little higher than that, but the average is actually far lower. So this is what happens when you ask people to participate in an opt-in basis. Hey, send you an email and say, hey, why don't you sign up, connect up your thermostat, connect up your EV charger, and we'll give you some money, we'll give you an incentive, we'll give you something over time. Those programs have a fairly low ceiling. The solution that has emerged is not terribly surprising when you think about consumer behavior in general, but is sort of new to our space, which is let's enroll customers at a moment they're already taking action. Let's make it nearly automatic. So what you're seeing now is when a thermostat is installed, the installation process will suggest make very easy support enrollment in programs at that moment. You'll see that, of course, now with EV chargers. We're seeing that increasingly with batteries when people are particularly leasing battery systems. So you're getting the decision at the beginning when it's going in, when you're already dealing with it. Hey, do you want to save some extra money? Do you want to participate in something that helps the community? Click here. And those programs are much more successful than the retroactive, hey, you have a piece of equipment, why don't you have a thermostat, why don't you come join us? The challenge that creates for folks in utility program world is that those enrollment decisions are driven through private companies. The utility sending an email later or whatever will never hit the scale. So it really calls for these partnerships between those like Google Nest or Tesla or others who make the equipment, and making sure that then those programs are aligned for enrollment, or there are pathways into that automatic or close to automatic enrollment that feed into those programs at the time. What happens? Well, Renew Home, which is the new where Google Nest has partnered, a private sector partner to deliver all of these services around to utilities, whatnot. They have achieved 60 to 80% enrollment of new smart thermostats, Nest thermostats, and have now achieved 4 gigawatts nationally in controllable thermostat demand. Another example, the Sonova, which unfortunately, of course, went bankrupt, but now its predecessor for a component of the third-party owned system, SunStrong, and it's I've done some work with, has, again, auto-enrolling battery systems, particularly in Puerto Rico, where the batteries on people's homes are a critical component to the grid. And again, saying, hey, we're going to bring you into this program. We're going to pay you for it. And you can always opt out and change your settings, but let's bring you in. In Puerto Rico, the program uses 20 to 30% of the battery capacity at any time. It does not drain the entire battery. But that, again, has achieved this 60 to 80% participation among those that have batteries. So these are really key ways of getting scale, but they do require us to operate a little differently and to work across the stakeholder groups, not just within a utility or a utility program service provider approach. Number 2, behavioral exchange rate. And this is one that I hope if there's one thing that comes out of all of this we get, which is that we tend to want to incentivize residential customers on an ongoing basis for when we call them and ask them to participate. And so it tends to be a future uncertain stream of money that come later. So for example, you'd say, great, get this battery. And over time, there's this program that if they call you, pays you, and you could make up to $1,000 a year, you could make zero. And the reality is that people discount anything like that dramatically. A sort of best case scenario is here, that you get about 35 cents on the dollar. And this is backed by a lot of behavioral economic and psychology research. So if you've got something in which over the lifetime, like a battery is worth $11,000, that you'd pay a customer $11,000 over time. At the moment they're making a choice or looking at it, they view that value at $3,800 at best. So this is why we want to try and think about those upfront incentives, reducing the price of equipment upfront, providing those benefits at the beginning, and then being able to make use of the thermostat over or the battery or the EV charger or whatever else over time. So these are just really key behavioral economics and economics components that I think have been missed by programs because we're trying to reward particular behavior. But if you don't actually pull that in front, it makes it much harder for people to value it. Third, make it bankable. And this is, again, a very related issue. And these numbers are general, but based on some reality from the market. Kind of taking what we said. So if you want to take a demand response program, a virtual power plant program, a grid services program for, say, a battery, and you say, great, I'd like to offer somebody who has solar to get a battery. If you want to do like a $16,000 battery retrofit on an existing home that has solar, and you offer that today, including the ITC, they're going to end up spending somewhere around $150 a month on their lease. And if you then that's the price tag they're going to see. And if you could say, look, you're going to have these savings from this demand response program, this grid services program, whatever it is, but they're going to come over time and they're variable. People get anchored on that price, the $144, and it's hard to get them to think about it differently for the reasons we've talked about. So moving from a sort of energy transaction basis, this performance-based ongoing bit, to a capacity construct, which is you're going to reduce the price of that lease up front for the value of those kilowatts or megawatts over the lifetime, the 10 years. And this is now, there's enough data to support these kinds of approaches where you can really sort of bring in here, hey, look, if we need to procure at $100 a kilowatt year, let's drive that up front. When somebody gets the battery has, is available to the customer 90% of the time, and always at least 20% or more is in the battery. But instead, you're going to get a lower lease payment. The utility gets 10% of the time. The utility gets the ability to dispatch it a certain number of hours, a certain number of times. And you embed that capacity value up front. And you can see over sort of just some examples here, and again, just indicative examples, that it's a much more compelling lease offer. And that is actually, it's the same amount of money. It's just a much more compelling for a customer way to do it. And programs that start to move this way deal with that behavioral economics issue really successfully. And I think is a really key way for us to sort of go forward. So those are sort of three examples of on the ground experience in terms of moving towards getting to larger scale involvement, larger scale in capacity, and larger scale participation. As you heard from Sean, the shed, the shift, the modulate, the generate, all of those are really important. All of those have enormous value, but they all need participation. And so these are really geared towards deciding how much a megawatt, a kilowatt is worth from a program like this, and starting to build in a process from the beginning that gets to large scale participation. So I will, I think, leave it there on my little thank you slide. By all means, happy to chat with you now with any questions and or follow up later. But I hope that was sort of a helpful understanding of some of the ways that we're starting to learn how to get to the next stage of these programs.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cisco, for that overview. There's a comment that came in from Kevin Crawford. I'm just going to read it because I think the context is important instead of trying to summarize it. As someone at a small utility, getting the attention of large OEMs to target customers at the time of purchase through in-app enrollment or working through integration with our DERMS is often a major challenge. How big of a barrier to customer enrollment is walled gardens? In other words, certain OEMs qualifying based on per device fees. And Kevin, I saw you come on video. You want to follow up on that with Cisco or elaborate? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to give some more context. And thank you, Cisco, for the presentation. I guess my question is more specifically on that last piece. I'm working at a co-op launching a EV charging demand response program and a battery program as well. And the messaging has been challenging to members on what devices qualify. And we found it's often those OEMs who have sort of a more open API protocol or lower device per device fees for our DERMS provider. Um, how big of a barrier, I guess, yeah, on your kind of experience in the thermostat space was getting those pieces in play? Because I've found we spent a lot of time on, figuring out the back end of certain OEMs, and getting Wi-Fi connectivity figured out, and those sort of small things that can break a program that you don't kind of think of up front when you're kind of working through, per kilowatt incentives and things like that.
Look, it's a huge problem. And so I just went through a set of things that I think we're learning from program design basis and other things. But your point, you're highlighting essentially the equally, if not more important, other side of this, certainly equally important, which is that the industry itself needs to be able to provide a set of equipment and interconnections, and the walled gardens are real. I'd say that the problem on the walled garden side, and the other thing is significant, and it's in part, I think, I'd say stepping back, the problem in traditional grid services demand response approaches, virtual power plant in particular, as these evolve, is that, you can say, look at these Brattle reports and the DOE liftoff report and other things. You're like, oh my goodness, this is so much better, so much cheaper, so much faster. But then you look at the value stack that is being, that you say you're monetizing. And it's not just the energy market value. It's not just the capacity. It's ancillary. It's emergency response. There's this whole list of transmission and distribution, of course. This whole list of things. Most programs don't access that, right? You have to pick one. So you're saying, like, look, even though we're giving all of these benefits, we're in many cases prohibited from allowing people to get value from more than one category, even though you are providing value in more than one category. So we're not creating sometimes enough money on one side. That is a program design issue as well. The other side of it is there's like, instead of having one counterparty who owns a power plant who's like, do I turn it on or not? Pay me. You've got like 5 random entities all with their hand out saying, give me some money. So you've got OEMs being like, oh my goodness, I can have a long-term relationship with a customer and I can make money and I can do all these things. And you have service providers all playing key roles, but all of which are sort of building a business kind of around taking a share of that money. So we have too many people trying to get paid, and we have not nearly enough money on the other side because we're not valuing the stack. Both of those, I think, have to change. That does mean that we need to make it much easier for devices, appliances people are getting to connect in. We need to make that cheaper because we can't pay 6 different entities all for the value of, you can't pay all of them at once. But I also think we need to look at the other side, which is part of this is we're not valuing what we're providing, what the benefits of this nearly enough, and that also has to be addressed. The interoperability technical components of it are getting fixed. Like, these are getting better. Like the pay walls are maybe getting worse at the moment, but the interoperability issues are getting easier. And I do think we're going to end up pretty soon where that's not the issue. But I do think that deciding who gets paid what, how much the customer gets paid versus the this and that and the other, are going to end up being pretty significant. I'm suggesting in that you want to pay the customer upfront in a cheaper device or at a moment they're setting it up, and not worry about trying to incentivize them as much going forward, because they don't value that as much as an entity will. So that is a place in which I just think there's money to be had, because the value of customers putting on those future dollars is way less than a you would, or a finance provider, or an OEM.
Got it. Thank you. And quick follow-up, just so I'm clear. In the cases that you do have to do an ongoing incentive, do you recommend a fixed, have the utility take that risk, and sort of do customers value a fixed incentive as opposed to like you can earn up to this, but depending on X, Y, and Z?
So obviously part of what we did successfully with Ohm Connect was actually move towards a place in which it was variable, but it was it was near instantaneous knowledge. It was more like a game. It was like, hey, here's a thing right now or tomorrow. You could earn money. You do it and immediately give feedback. You did earn rewards. You did earn money. So it's this engagement where people get a little dopamine hit and they're engaged and they can see the benefits of the things they're doing. So there are definite ways to build in performance, and I think you do need to have some ongoing performance requirements if you are asking people to give up ongoing comfort or other things. But as we go forward, if you can now, I know from more than one of the companies, if you can get a pre-installed thermostat, which just is you can give it away for free, but it has the demand response built in. You're not going to turn it off. It's not a feature that you can turn off. So it's going to do small adjustments in your temperature, those kinds of things where you can embed the value up front. Hey, here's a much cheaper thing. The batteries, for sure, we're starting to see these lower cost upfront batteries in exchange for we will control your battery going forward in these ways. So the performance ongoing is important when you need the customer to deal with something they don't like or to continue to agree to something. But the more we can get that decision made up front, take away some of the discomfort from them and allow that to play out, I think it's better to put the incentive up front and worry less about performance. But there's going to be variation.
Got it. Appreciate it. Thank you.
One last super quick question, Cisco. You talked about valuation, the lack of really full valuation vis-a-vis these reports that have come out that talk about how wonderful VPPs are and the opportunities they present. Tying this to Sean's presentation that really illustrates when we're talking about demand response, we're really talking about a very, very small subset of those opportunities for valuation. So do you have any recommendations for some of the folks at PUCs, utilities? Is this who's ultimately, do you think, responsible for getting that full suite of valuation opportunities implemented, and that therefore, an OEM can really extract the full suite of them, as opposed to really, well, this utility only has this part of the value stack, another utility only has this other part of the value stack. Who do you think is ultimately responsible for kind of enabling that full value stack that, like Sean showed, we really are not seeing predominantly in the industry?
Obviously, this is at its heart a regulatory decision. So I think you're absolutely right to sort of point at the pure PUC side. I mean, I think that the way that utilities and others silo and work it can be problematic as well. What we have seen that I think that works in the near term is that you don't try and avoid double dipping all the time. So I think there's a lot of concern in program design that somebody's going to get paid twice for the same benefit, for the same kind of thing. And what that ends up meaning is they're not getting paid for a bunch of benefits that they're actually creating that are connected. So if we step back for a minute in a program design basis, particularly on a regulatory side, and say, great, we have a capacity benefit, we have an energy benefit, we have a hyperlocal or system T&D benefits. Let's kind of put together those and then embed that into one price per kilowatt, price per megawatt, or some sort of RFP or other process like that. That will allow people to that will allow everybody to look at this more holistically and put more money on the table. I think as long as each entity is saying, I'm only looking at your capacity or resource adequacy, whatever it is, and that's my only box. It makes sense if you're the employee or the regulator that's your job. You can only look at that. We're never going to get to the scale that we need. I have yet to see a program. We have some examples of places where it's coming. They're both coming in, but we've yet to see a program, I think, really take advantage of that. And I think it's going to be absolutely necessary for the next stage of this. I think you're muted, and if you want me to keep talking, I will.
Yes,
But
I am.
I am pretty sure it's my turn.
Yes, Cisco. No, I was saying thank you very much, especially for connecting that back to Sean's stuff and the opportunities presented going forward. So let's hand things over to Eliot at this point to close out our formal presentations. Eliot, take it away.
Thank you very much, Pete. Yeah, I think this presentation will complement the two other presentations we've seen so far. And I know that on a previous one of these webinars that my colleague Steve Schiller had presented on evaluation. And so some of what I'll present today goes sort of, in a bit more detail on that. So talking about the actual analytics side of things here when it comes to demand flexibility, I have two pieces in the presentation. The first is when you're looking at an individual facility, how do you use some data analysis to work out what's the best strategy in that situation? And that's really focused more on the commercial side of things. I think it's less of a consideration for residential. Maybe it would come up, but it's sort of overkill really for a residential situation. It is the kind of analysis also that could extend to the industrial sector, which is a hugely untapped sector when it comes to demand flex. And we hope to be a big part of changing that. That's a whole different story, though. So that's the first part, really looking at analysis at the facility level to look for opportunities and really understand the best strategy. The second part of the presentation is a bit of a deeper dive on the measurement and verification aspect. So when you've done some demand response at a facility, how do you actually accurately capture the impacts? And it gets a little bit more toward the scientific work here at the lab that's less about programs and sort of implementation strategies and more about the sort of technical weeds of things. So without further ado, I will jump in here for the first part of that. So demand flex analysis, the majority of demand response activity has been in the residential sector. I think that the work at the Energy Markets and Policy Group at the lab has sort of documented that pretty widely, and many of you will know a lot of the reasons for that. It's very scalable, looking at specific devices like smart thermostats, how scalable that is. And it's been hugely successful. Moving to expand a bit more in the commercial space, it gets a lot more complicated. The payoffs can be higher because the facilities use more energy, but of course it's more complex. And so some of the work that we have done at Berkeley Lab that we have ongoing is to provide technical assistance through a program that's sponsored by FEMP, the Federal Energy Management Program, where we interface directly with federal agencies to help them work out what's going to work for them. So I have a few slides digging into that. And first off, something I am still coming up to speed with is around actual utility bill structures. If you have been exposed to utility bills from multiple regions, you will probably know that the structures are very complex. There's certain line items that are driven by your kilowatt hours energy consumption. There's others that are based on your kilowatts peak demand, and that could be your single highest value of kilowatts over the month. It could be the highest kilowatt value within a certain time window on certain months of the year. And the way those costs show up can vary as well. So sometimes that's just each month you get the charges for that month. In some regions, PJM territory is one of these. There's a capacity charge. So they take certain 5 days through the summer that they don't tell you up front which ones they're going to be. They will look at your peak demand in a 3 to 7 p.m. window, and that sets a charge that you will pay the whole of the following year. Every month, that same fixed charge every month the following year. So this isn't intended to be training on billing. There are some databases that the lab has developed looking at that sort of so-called time variable pricing formulas, etc. But I just wanted to communicate really that for a facility that is looking to do something around demand flex, it really helps to understand how am I paying for my energy? What determines how much I'm being charged in my bill? And based on that, what benefit is there to me in just reducing my demand or in shifting my demand and shifting my consumption to a different area? All of that is completely separate to a demand response program, which, as we've heard about on this webinar today, is more of the format of, okay, tomorrow we want you to do X between these hours and shed this much load 5 times in the summer. 4 times, 3 times, 10 times, what have you. So I think this is kind of step one in analyzing data when it comes to demand flexibility, is that bill analysis. And then in concert with that, look at what demand response options are available to you as a facility. There's no hard and fast rules. There's no formula I can give you, but certainly having that knowledge up front is what helps you make best decisions. So next up, you don't need to read everything on these slides, but I just want to give you sort of a sense of the next level analysis that we do. So what you see here is some load shapes. These are hourly load shapes. So along the x-axis, that is hour 0 to hour 24 in a given day. And each of these charts represents the load profile on each day of 1 week. So we're looking at 6 weeks here through the summer period, and you can see for this specific facility, there is some variation day to day. You see that profile is rising and falling, but there's a very clear stepwise change in consumption. This is quite typical of a commercial facility that runs, let's say, between 9 and 5. The equipment, HVAC, typically will start up a couple hours, 2 to 3 hours before the people occupy the building, and then there might be some HVAC use maybe an hour after the end of the occupied day. So again, this doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what you can do to manage your consumption, but it starts you thinking about, okay, are my profiles consistent day to day? Do they change from season to season? Do I have these low time periods overnight, which could potentially be places you could shift load from the daytime to the nighttime? You can also look at things like, well, if I want to use my HVAC settings to shed load for a few hours, what will happen if I pre-cool? Will that just set a new peak earlier in the day? So all these kind of questions can come up. On the next slide, you'll see that another angle to this load shape analysis is to look at if there's specific time periods of interest. I mentioned for the PJM territory that 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. is a pretty critical time window. That's when the system hits its peak through the summer months. And so the so-called capacity charge in this region is going to be based on your peak in that time period. So irrespective of your monthly bills, if you can shift consumption outside of that 3 to 7 p.m. window, even if it's just a small amount of load shed, it can have pretty significant financial benefits for you. Now, this will change from region to region. I believe in California, it's more of a 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. is the typical sweet spot for looking for those reductions and where those peak charges really hit. Don't quote me on that. I think it's a little bit later there, though. As was mentioned in other presentations today, in some regions you might get some winter peaks in the morning. So this varies. Whatever analysis you do needs to be tailored to what are the priorities in your specific region. Let's see what's next here. I threw these in just to give a sense of, I showed you one example of a certain facility. You had that kind of top hat shape, very typical of commercial buildings. It will not always be that neat and tidy. So these are two separate sets of analysis you see on this slide. On the left-hand side, you have buildings which really don't have much of a top hat shape, much more flat in terms of their consumption profile. You'll see the sort of the top 3 particular, almost completely flat. You have a little bit of a bump in the lower profiles, but this wasn't a huge surprise in this case. This is a campus with buildings that have a very high process load, a lot of data centers, a lot of scientific equipment, a lot of 24/7 equipment. There really is a lot less you can do here. If you have something like thermal storage or battery storage, of course, that will always be helpful for this kind of situation. Acknowledging that if you discharge a battery or a thermal energy storage facility, then you need to actually charge that up again after hours. So you always have to be careful again if you're saving in one place and just adding loads somewhere else. But just generally, you would approach this left-hand situation a lot more with fewer options, I'll say. On the right-hand side, this is digging into one specific facility on that same campus, one of the smaller facilities. And, you'll notice here that the dark blue line is the average profile, but there's really not a lot of consistency between all the individual profiles in that sort of 24-hour load shape that just have so much variation. There are things happening in this facility that are clearly, you know, probably process loads, a lot of things switching on, off. Maybe there's some potential to schedule some of those so they don't all happen at the same time, but that's a case where the data perhaps doesn't tell you enough at the first blast, and you need to sort of go with the facility and really dig around to what equipment is operating and how is it scheduled. So that's the data analysis piece. I have just a couple slides here, just to kind of let you know the kind of framing that we come with when we've done the analysis and we say, okay, now let's look at what are the opportunities on the left-hand side, just a kind of conceptual idea that you have these much larger loads. If you have refrigeration, your HVAC systems will be a large load, industrial machinery would be a large load. And then at the second tier, water pumping, air compressors, lighting, these vary by market sector, but there's some generic pieces here. Lighting, of course, is something which would have been in the bottom chunk there, but that's a lot more efficient these days. At the top, non-essential loads. So what's fairly typical is that the non-essential loads at the top might be the ones you can most easily influence, but they're going to be less beneficial. And then the inverse is true at the bottom level, that you really, there's only so much you can do with your refrigeration and HVAC systems, but it has a big payoff. And so on the right-hand side, just got a little breakout really of the kind of things that show up in that top and bottom bucket. And we have some self-assessment tools, or somebody can come into a facility and do a bit of a sort of energy audit with demand in mind, and just look at all these opportunities for both demand reduction and also demand response potential for participation in programs. So the idea, of course, is to hit that sweet spot in the graphic on the right-hand side. The sweet spot will be the large loads that you can adjust without any kind of disruption. The next best would be large loads with minimal disruption. So typically, if you have the HVAC set points that you can adjust for a few hours, there will be some disruption. There'll be some impact on occupant comfort. And the intent is that you can communicate clearly enough and the benefits are high enough that is a disruption that's worth having, 5, 6, 10 times a year. And so on the left-hand side, I won't go through each of these, but this is just looking at some of the things that can both shed load and or shift load. And EV charging is an area of great potential as well. I think there's been a lot of demonstrated benefits there. So lots more could be said on that, but for now I'll just leave it there and shift to the other topic: measurement and verification, analytical approaches. Some of the work that we've done at the lab over the last 5 to 8 years, we actually have a couple decades of M&V experience from far before I joined the lab, and there are lots of people way smarter than me that develop all of these. But one of the pieces that we looked at, I'm going to show you some results from a couple of our papers. The first one was looking to see if we could improve upon some of the industry accepted methods. So a very common method for assessing the impact of a demand response event is to look at the energy consumption within that same time window on the 5 or 10 previous days prior to that event day. And they would be the same day type. So the 5 to 10 weekdays, looking at the 2 to 6 p.m. window, and compare what happens on the day of the event and say, well, the average of the last 10 days, we'll say that's what would have happened in the absence of our demand response event, you can then quantify that gap, and you have that measurement of what didn't happen. So that's one way to do it, averaging just past 5 or 10 days. Another one would be weather matching, just finding the previous 5 to 10 days that had the same peak temperature as the day of the event. So these are widely used, widely accepted. Sometimes they're used in comparison groups to aggregate loads. And we were curious in this research to see if more modern regression-based or machine learning-based methods might offer an improvement over that. So we chose for test, we had a few meters from a few hundred commercial buildings. We were looking at the 12 to 6 p.m. time window just as a reference point. And the comparison between different model types was based on certain statistical metrics known as model fitness metrics. So this is one of the methods. Time of week and temperature is a regression method developed by Berkeley Lab, very widely accepted for whole year energy efficiency type energy calculations. And we adapted that with a 7-day baseline here. So in orange, we have the 7 days that were used to train this time of week and temperature model. In the green portion of this, that's that 12 to 6 p.m. window on the given day. And then the actual load in that window is marked in red here. So just to be clear, we're checking the baseline model accuracy. So no demand response event happened. We're just saying if we have a building where nothing happened, we use this method to develop a baseline and then predict that 12 to 6 p.m. on the following day. Let's see if it was close to the mark. And so we use that same method for all of the modeling approaches, and that's how we developed the model fit metrics. How close were we? We have a lot of results in the paper, but I'll just kind of give some of the high level headlines here. So as I mentioned, we looked at this across hundreds of meters, thousands of tests on those meters. And in this box whisker chart, the midline of this box represents the median value of the statistical metric known as normalized mean bias error. So, how close was it? Did it tend to be over predicting or under predicting? And this is all the different methods. So we have DM is day matched, TOWT, the time of week and temperature. We had a couple different formulations of that. And then we have the weather matched. So if we just think about the medians, one thing to say is they all consistently underpredict. So their prediction of consumption is actually less than what it actually would have been. So that tends to be a bias. There are some adjustments that can be done that sort of partially compensate for that, but it is fairly common that these kind of models underpredict on peak days. But if you look at the distribution across the many hundreds of tests we did, we could say, well, that the medians were varying quite a bit. We could say some were better than the others in terms of just the median value, but the amount of overlap in the distributions of all these results suggests there's not a very statistically significant difference between these approaches. So I think that one of the outcomes of this was just to say, okay, you're using the standard day matched averaging or the weather matched averaging that are very common in the field. This research didn't suggest that there was anything really much wrong with that, and the fact that they're simpler, I think, makes them attractive. Of course, there may be some circumstances. There could be different test data sets where different results would happen, but for this result, I think we found that all of them were relatively robust. All of them tended to underpredict. We haven't found the perfect solution yet, but yeah, it was instructive for sure. So that was research looking at the demand response use case. I have another paper here that was looking at model prediction for every hour of the year. So this was the thinking behind this was that I think as there's more mix of generation, there's more utility scale storage, etc., the time when you actually need reduction on the utility system can vary a lot. And so we're thinking rather than just focus on summer, noon to 6, let's just see, what if these kind of load shift events are needed at other times of the year? So it was a similar kind of experimental approach, hundreds of meters, thousands of tests. And I'll just kind of walk you through how we presented the results here. So if you imagine the hours from 1 to 24 in a given day, we got the month of January. So if we looked at all the first hours of the day across January, across all of our hundreds of buildings data set, if we try to model the accuracy of our modeling approach, we found that there was 0.94 percent error. And this will make more sense as I get to the end of the whole visualization, but just know that what it means is that in this hour of this day in January, this is what you might expect in terms of bias. So it's sort of under predicting a little bit for this hour. If we then map that to every hour of the day in January, we'll see that the accuracy of this specific model varies for different hours of the day. We have a bit of positive error in the early hours and late, negative error on these weekdays. None of it is that extreme, but this is just how it looks for weekdays in January in terms of error for this model. We can distinguish between weekdays and weekends. And again, the context of this is we don't know in 5 or 10 years or 20 years time, what's going to be the times of greatest need for shift in the utility systems. And so what do we need our models to be able to do accurately? So again, we can compare weekdays and weekends for January load shape. And then there's a lot to take in here, but this is each strip here is a different model. So we have GBM, which is a machine learning model. We have the time of week and temperature regression. We have the weather matched and the day matched as well. On the previous set of demand response analysis, I said that the distribution didn't show significant difference between the models. In this case, we do. So the GBM model, the sort of paler, where it's more pale, that means lower error, closer to a zero bias. Where we have either dark blue or dark orange, that's where things get a little bit iffy in terms of model error. And we see, for instance, in the post-noon time period, the early morning period, models are acting differently. And I think you don't need to necessarily take away from this presentation all the specifics here. I think the main point that we try to communicate in the paper is that between the different models, there are some differing expectations you can have. And you can do this analysis for a specific utility region that might have different behaviors in terms of how models will follow the loads in the meter data that you can get hold of. So headline, the machine learning model was best of the bunch here. Weather matched wasn't too bad, but we certainly see a lot of variation coming up for different times of day, different times of year. I'm getting short on time here, so I'll just very quickly mention this, that another piece of research that was in this second paper was that we looked at if these demand response events get called more frequently, if a load shift is required more frequently or a demand response, you're going to lose some of what you would have used as your baseline data. So if you imagine you have 20 consecutive days when somebody's trying to do demand response, then those are 20 days that you can't use for the baseline for a given event day. And so this piece of research that we've charted here is to look at, if you want to measure a specific day, what happens if you lose one of the baseline days, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 50? The the more baseline days you lose for your modeling, the more likely it is that you're going to have some error. And so this was just a project to assess what was that impact. So this line here shows that, up to 10 to maybe even 20 days, you don't have a significant drop off, a significant increase in error. But, for a couple of the models that really did start to jump up after 20 days. So that, again, you'd have to look in the paper for the full details, but this is just to let you know it's something that we've been looking into as a lab. What are the practicalities in terms of measuring impacts that can happen as the market for demand response evolves. Just have a few more minutes for questions now.
Thanks very much, Eliot. Let's see, any questions from folks out there? Don't see any in the chat. Feel free to come off mute. Cisco, you have a question for Eliot. Sure thing.
Eliot, this is fabulous stuff, and I really appreciate it. Can't wait to dig into the paper. But I'm curious, one of the things that we had seen in the past was real variation related to, especially on the in the fall, we were losing solar during earlier in the day, it was messing with baselines quite a bit for solar homes. And so we had a whole sort of conversation around, especially as solar became, 20% of single family homes in California, we were seeing this huge subset in which the baseline methodology, which is super typical, as you said, is kind of getting wonked out by the fact that we were having changes in solar that would be relevant within a couple of week period. I don't know if you saw any of that or took a look at any of that, or I just thought that was an interesting thing that we were starting to see.
Yes, it's a great question, Cisco. We didn't see that mainly because the sort of the root of our work was in the commercial sector, and typically we find that where there's solar, it will be metered separately, so we can actually get fairly clean data on the actual consumption. And so that tended to be fairly separate. It was, there were some rare cases where we actually had sort of more net metering where it was a problem. On the residential side, I confess I don't know of any research on that. I suspect there would be, but I haven't been involved in that.
Okay. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour. It's been an hour and a half. Boy, that went by fast. Really appreciate all of you folks for attending today. Really appreciate the contributions of our speakers. They all have their contact information, I believe, listed at the end of their presentations that are now posted online. So if you have any follow-up questions for any of them, please do feel free to reach out to them. Have a great rest of your summer. We'll circle back in August and see you all then. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.